Step into the room. It's Rose Resource Room. I'm your host, Rose-Anne Uwague, and today I'm joined by my special guest, Lauren Gideon. Welcome to the show, Lauren.
Thanks so much for having me, Rose. I'm excited to be here and it's lovely to see you again.
Awesome. So before we get started, please introduce yourself, but you cannot use roles and you can't use titles. So you're not Lauren the mom, you're not Lauren the title. Tell me about you, the woman, and then after you tell me about yourself, you can
Then,
share all your roles and the hats that you wear and play and all the things.
so you're looking for adjectives, which is a great way to punish somebody that's concrete into an abstract position. So describe me. So I am a glutton for punishment. Um, I, I was talking to my oldest yesterday, and I'm most motivated to do the things that people say cannot be done.
Ooh.
So that has been a force in my life for good and for bad. And so um, that is some adjectives I love to learn. Um, I'm a very curious person, and I'm not always obsessed with conclusions as much as just exploring the what ifs. So there's some adjectives.
Okay, I love that. And I just want everyone to be clear that you are not prepared for that question, but you completely nailed it. So, yes, doing the impossible. Love it. All right, now tell me all the hats you wear, all the roles you play, all your titles, and all the things.
So I'm a wife of 20 years.
Woohoo.
Um, me and my husband live here south of Des Moines in Iowa. We have 7 kids. Two oldest have graduated high school, and then 5 others are still in our homeschool, all the way down to fourth grade. And so I love that. We've been homeschooling since my oldest started school, through classical conversations most of the way. It was something we found along our journey that was a lifesaver because the thing that paralyzed me was so many back-to-back grades and doing specific grade level content with a large family seemed to be impossible without figuring out a way to bring us together and to be more of a family school. So I've been homeschooling and then because homeschooling is both expensive and hard, I found myself needing to engage more in different roles within classical education to grow me as a person and also to offset our homeschooling costs. And so what was mostly utility and necessity at the beginning is kind of how I grew up, so to speak, because the leadership experiences and the training within classical conversations as I served in different various needs that our area had um, developed both my education side of my experience and the leadership side. So I served in various roles and through our state classical conversations network. And then presently, I serve as Director of Government Relations for Classical Conversations, which is just a merging of all my passions. It was through homeschooling that I fell in love with American history, pre-political, pre-American documents, thoughts. A colleague and I, in a post 2020 world, trying to figure out what is it our lane to give back to our country and to our community. Um, Took the resources we gained and learned through homeschooling and applied them to adult education classes in our community, teaching founding documents, pre-founding documents. And so that only cultivated my love of, I would say, applied history. So people cringe when they hear the word politics, but um, I love applied history in modern settings, and a lot of that happens in the political space. So I did that for a while. I helped with the U.S. Senate campaign for a while, and then this role of government relations for classical conversations came on and just merged all my passions together. And so I'm a very happy person sitting in that role for classical conversations.
I love all of that. And like one of as you were talking, I just thought about how multifaceted you are, but it's really the colliding of all your passions and all your skills. And it feels so natural and authentic because I feel like sometimes we have a personality and then we have a profession. But for
Mm.
But what I find most fulfilling is when all the things collide. Like I am, and these are just all the other things that surround me. So I love it for you.
I love it. And the best part too is when you find your niche and your passion, you meet other people with the same passion. So meeting people like you and other people that are passionate about ideas of freedom, education, and the combination of those things is really the most rewarding part of what I do.
Oh, I love it, love it, love it. So let's talk about what you just said. So education and independence, these are two words we all know, but when you put them together, something beautiful and magical happens. So while it's easy to define education, easy to define independence, when you put
Mm.
it together, what is education independence?
Well, I think some things are best defined by what they're not. And
Ooh.
I think what you're saying too is it's a little bit of a shock to a system. Our system is because our current American paradigm is so far removed from this idea that when I present this, it's like, what is that? It's countercultural, it's uncomfortable, it's so many things, but it has two great words in it, so I don't know how to feel about that thing. And so I love bringing those things together because um, well, I think education is a commodity that everybody understands is very important. Anybody anywhere understands education is important to the degree that they can use that word education and they can amass a huge group of people to support it without even defining what it is that they're talking about. And
Mm.
so part of, I think, where we're at is it's impossible if you use the word education, kind of if you use the word choice or freedom or anything like that, it's like nobody's allowed to disagree with that because it's such a good thing. And so defining our terms, kind of important, but education being like a soul of a society, understanding that most people understand, there's that saying you can either give a man a fish or teach him to fish. And we all understand that teaching somebody to provide for themselves is much more fulfilling, satisfying, and sustainable for that person. And so even though we understand, feeding, clothing, shelter is important as a nation, we have embraced the idea that education is equally or maybe more important than those physical needs. And so that's education, but the independence then is the operative word because so long historically, I mean, I want to put this in context because we're homeschoolers, we love history. And so a lot of people think state provided education is the way that it's always been. We understand, though, that education under the purview of the state is actually a very new thing, historically speaking. This is the untried experiment that we have pressed upon our society. And but for our generation, we know nothing different
Right.
than education system nested underneath the state. Again, because it's so important, the state must be the only one that can provide this thing. And so when we go out propagating an idea that's completely contrary, um, it stings people sometimes because we have such a sentimental, nostalgic view of modern education that sometimes our imaginations can't tolerate anything different from that.
Mm.
And so the thing that we love, education, um, advocating for it to be a deeply personal thing that we hold as private property, distinct and owned by the family, instead of from the state, is revolutionary.
I love that. I love all of it. So I know that there are four pillars that inform your work. Can you tell me what those four pillars are? And then can you just define and kind of like walk through what those mean?
Absolutely. So, they are really short and quick and to the point, and they're parallel because we're classicists and we love that. So they all start with the word independent, obviously trying to drill that down. But we believe in four things: independent parents, independent funding, independent pursuits, and independent ideas. So I'll backtrack and say what those are. Most people are very familiar and comfortable, at least in the homeschooling space, with the idea of independent parents because we understand that the role of parenting was given to parents by God to bring up children. And so we have these statements that inform. So I'll just read it. It says, God trusts parents with their children, and so should we. So that's a statement that's informed classical conversations for close to 20 years. Therefore, we affirm that parental rights come from God and should be protected from the state. And so this idea that we have different jurisdictions of authority, the state has their own and families have their own, and we believe protecting parental rights to direct the upbringing of their children should be protected from the state. So that's the first one. Again, a lot of people are very excited about protecting parental rights. The next one, though, is a little bit more controversial with this funding piece in the year 2025. It's the buzzword. And so we actually believe in independent funding, and it has everything to do with ownership. And we understand some things are so precious. You don't want to be in situations where you co-own something that's precious with somebody that might not share your values. So our statement for that one is education is a responsibility of the family. We got that one from the statement above, with support from fellow believers. Therefore, we recognize that the financial obligation, a component of that responsibility, also remains on parents with support from private voluntary benefactors. So, part of wrestling with the weight of financial responsibility is the fact that we understand that there's people with needs in every society, and so education is not any different. Specifically, educational poverty, those who can't afford or not have access to certain things, is not different than those maybe who don't have access to food, shelter, clothing. And so, biblically, we have been given very clear directives on how to live generously and how to take care of those among us that have needs. And we advocate that education isn't any different from those. Like God loves a cheerful giver, and those that have should give out of abundance for those to those who do not have, and that they should never be given giving, sorry, out of compulsion,
Right.
which is the taxpayer funded model. And so we do believe that the taxpayer funded model for taking care of philanthropic um, needs is not biblical. So hopefully that unpacks that one in the most generous way. And then we believe in independent pursuit. And so this statement is the purpose of education is to know God and to make him known. That's specifically Classical Conversations mission statement. But our therefore is we uphold that the sacred pursuit of education exists outside the jurisdiction of the state. Now, there's so many deep words in here that whisper back to things from the past, so I kind of want to unpack it a little bit. But the fact that education being a sacred pursuit is kind of shocking to some people. A lot of people think that, there's nothing sacred about math, or there's nothing sacred about
Mhm.
historical facts or maps, geography. Um, but the more you peel back the layers, you'll find out every educational pursuit is predicated on some sort of truth claims.
Okay.
Do we expect that 2 plus 2 is going to equal 4 today and tomorrow and the next day? Are we expecting the patterns to replicate themselves across spheres of study? Everything about education speaks to, in one paradigm, either design, intention, purpose, order, or chaos, chance, random, absence of truth claims, which isn't self a truth claim. And so, whether we like it or not, all education is a religious pursuit. We just may not have acknowledged that. And if that's the case, we have to wrestle with the reality that philosophically our country is predicated on the concept that religion ought to be protected from the state. The famous Danbury Baptist letters between the Danbury Baptists and Thomas Jefferson talk about a hedge of protection, not to protect the government from the influence of the church, but to protect the religious community from the influence of the state. And so if what we've established are um, small micro religious institutions across our country predicating a worldview, um, well, we might have a conflict there with our First Amendment that says government has no jurisdiction to establish religious entities. So anyway, you can see how this unpacks. It's very complicated, but at its soul, I think what parents need to understand is all education is predicating a religious paradigm. It's about which religious paradigm is your education predicating or instilling, discipling. And so it's very serious that education is really discipleship, and you're making disciples for something. And what is that something? Sorry, I get excited about that one, obviously. But the last one is independent ideas. This is another fun idea because we believe wrestling with truth promotes blessing and virtue for the whole community. Therefore, we conclude that a flourishing society emerges from a free market of ideas. Now, I said at some point, it's easier to define something by what it's not.
Mhm.
if you do not have a free market of ideas, or if you have a quote unquote ministry of truth, there has been several dystopian novels depicting what kind of world that creates. You have a single narrative that has to be government approved and government defined. And while most people think that concept lives in those dystopian novels, some of us, living in a post-2020 world, realize there's a lot of collaboration between public interests to make sure particular narratives um, influence society and that there are no competition to those narratives. And if that exists, in the adult space, it was easy to see, I guess, as those classrooms were piped into family living rooms, that there are some ideas that are allowed and there are some ideas that are not allowed. And if these are state decided narratives, we don't have a free market of ideas where all questions are welcome. And there's no way we can argue things out and find the best ideas if the narrative is already captured. And so we just believe that a flourishing society is predicated on the ideas of free speech, free dialogue, free dissent, all of those things that made our country great and allowed truth to rise to the surface.
So, I really love the idea that you talked about worldview because, as Boda Basham would say, you can't send your children to Caesar for their
Mhm.
education and be surprised when they come home as Romans, right? May his soul rest in peace.
Mhm.
But we live in such a hustle and bustle culture that we rarely spend time to think critically. Because what
Mhm.
you're sharing, I've heard before, I've read those pillars, but there were still nuggets that I had to pick up that were new for me, like, oh, I never thought of that piece, or I never
Yeah.
thought of it from that angle. And it's so subtle because, like you said, if you use the word freedom and choice, like, what's not great about that? But then when you
Yeah.
see how things get perverted or twisted, we have to kind of slow down and think. Because I remember, Ronald Reagan's famous quote, the nine most terrifying words are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help, right? So even when you have well-meaning legislators who try to bring things into law or laws that were passed, their worldview may be different and it may not align with what you're trying to, promote. I don't know if this is a quote from Lee Borton's, but I remember at Forum in 2022 in Florida, she made a comment that said something to the fact that when you bring the government in, you take the C out, you take the Christian. So if you think
Mhm.
YMCA,
Yes.
YMCA was a Christian organization, and then it became, government got involved, and now the C, the Christian, came out. So it just makes me think how you remove the Christian element when you start to co-parent with the government. So for those who are hearing all of this for the first time, I really want them to walk away with clarity, knowing that nothing is free. Like this idea of, I just want to give you this government cheese, or there are always strings attached.
There has to be, and it comes to that idea of private property or shared ownership idea. If you share ownership with a taxpayer, which is a taxpayer-funded program, they give consent through their elections about how that money is spent. And it's only appropriate that they do. Our declaration says just powers derived from consent of the governed. And so when you have outside investors have a stake hold or a relationship in your homeschool, it is only just, actually, that they have a say in how those funds are spent. If they approve of how those funds are spent, are they, that's where we get things like oversight or testing or all those things, because actually, in a fiscally responsible paradigm, it's the responsibility of those who spend those taxpayer dollars to ensure that they are is limited in fraud. They are producing the highest ROI for the taxpayer because they understand it's not their money to spend, so they put those strings on, right, as mechanisms of accountability and oversight. Now, any other commodity, we would all be like, yes, that's good. Like if you're spending my money to build bridges in my state, I want to know that they're good bridges. So you better test them. You better have mechanisms of accountability and oversight and transparency so I know that that is a good thing for the public good. The problem is that I don't really want the public to weigh in on how I educate my family. I do things some people might consider strange, especially in 2025, I could say some funny things. But we read the Bible, we pray. We wrestle with ideas. We even read some things, like we read source documents from a lot of different worldviews.
Mhm.
And wrestling with those truths, it's a hard thing to distill, like what is right for my child and our family and our context. It's a very deeply personal, intimate thing that I don't want the public to weigh into. And to your point about YMCA and the Christian component, that actually ties into this idea, separation of church and state, separation of church and state. And so we have to keep religion out of it. Now, part of the problem is we already addressed that there is no non-religious education, but the world hasn't caught up with us on that part yet. And so their idea of keeping a separation is to make sure no Christian ideas. Now, secular humanist ideas, welcome, which is interesting because the US Supreme Court, at least in its definition, I wish I could just cite the case, has already listed secular humanism as a religion. And so, if you actually tried to get
Listen.
non-religious education, it's impossible. But in its immature phase, I guess, is well, we'll just eradicate Christian because that's the obvious thing.
Mm.
So there's already publicly funded programs that you can use your curriculum for this secular curriculum, but not for anything that mentions God. So for those that are like, oh, don't worry about that, that'll never happen. It's silly because it's happening right now in several different states and programs that predate the modern school choice wave, um, where like like at least classical conversations, for example, is explicitly not allowed. Now we're fine with this because we don't want public dollars coming to us anyway. But well, you're Christian, you're not allowed. And so what happens is it forces curriculum companies to compromise sometimes on their content. It forces parents to lie. Um, there are rules. Well, during school hours, you can't say God or use religious curriculum. And parents are happy to acquiesce to that because, well, we'll just do it after school. And so either one of two things happens. Either they follow the law and their children miss out on discipleship from 8 to 5 or whatever the time frame is, or they're actually propagating a worldview of deceit where they're modeling it's okay to lie to your government in order to get your government's money. And so a lot of times what we're teaching our kids has nothing, well, it has not nothing, it has more to do with our example than our content. And
Mhm.
so we need to remember that as we navigate the world we live in, we're modeling integrity, honesty, intentions, all those things uh, when we get into these sticky situations.
So prior to you saying that, you use the word ownership a lot. And I can see someone tolerating a landlord, telling them certain requirements. But you become emboldened when you own your home, when you have a mortgage, and someone tells you what to do. You're like, you can't tell me what to do. This is my house. I own this house. But I find it interesting that we don't typically view education as a private commodity or something we actually own. So when a child sees us investing in them, where it was either a parent who stepped away from the workforce to say, you know what, this is more important, it goes back to what you were saying in terms of it's not what's taught, it's what's caught. I can pull
Hmm.
any book, any curriculum, and say whatever I want to say, but they're looking at me and what I'm modeling. So when I'm saying to them, of course I can get this free money from the government to do this thing. And I say, no, I'm not going to because I believe in that independence. Or when I say, if I do this, I would have to compromise, and I'm not willing to compromise. So we will do without this thing, or we'll find another means. That's what we're modeling. So I just really hope that, like, for anyone who is on the fence, either like someone who didn't understand things about whether it's like educational savings accounts or school choice or all the different things. Like, I really hope people just go start to do some research, ask questions, think critically. But like for anyone who's on the fence or didn't quite understand what the controversy is, I hope they're beginning to understand that when we left the system, it wasn't just a decision that I don't want to be there, but it was a trust walk and it was a faith walk. So, in order
Yeah.
to be independent and separate, we have to continue to put our faith in God that He's not only going to provide academically, but financially and emotionally and all the things, right? So, I would just say to someone, like, don't straddle on both sides. Like, you don't want to have one arm and foot over here and one arm and leg on the other side. Like, that sounds dangerous. You might slip and hurt
It
yourself. But,
is.
seriously, you don't want to be lukewarm. So,
Yeah.
what are your final thoughts on this whole idea of separation? And like, what would you encourage someone who's like, yeah, Lauren, you can say whatever you want to say, but I have bills to pay. We all have bills to pay. Like, how would you encourage them?
I think the hardest part, what you talked about, is straddling that line. So, um, the ESA dollar amount, like in Arizona, I think is $7,000. So easy math. I had 7 kids at one point. I was homeschooling at $7,000 per kid. That's close to
Right.
$50,000. I think it's actually seven and a half. So $50,000 easy math. And so if I allow myself to sit and dwell on what good things I could do with $50,000, oh my goodness, so much good I could do. And mentally, almost that money is already spent. Um, and it's really hard to unspend money or time because a lot of people, for them, it's time they're getting back, that they're not having to get a part-time job, or they maybe have to like shop around and get secondhand curriculum. There's a lot of like time or financial investment that's represented in when you sit and dwell, like you said, and have your foot in both camps. It's so much harder to, I think, make a principled decision
Mm.
when you've done that. And I think that's part of the hard place about living in these states with money that's accessible and it's common. Um, Here's what I think about when I think about this idea of independence and private property, because in a lot of states, what's happening is the independent segment of the market is virtually being eradicated. And so there are fewer and fewer places that you could escape to, so to speak, that aren't publicly owned. Like, think if your state, like if it was all one giant state park and you couldn't escape to a place where this is my home, this is how we do life. It's all on publicly owned and operated places. Basically, that's what's happening with the education market. And so for me, when I think about $50,000, it's a huge, huge piece of change. But in the cause of independence,
Mm.
um, I've been thinking about it more, especially in the, like, there's been a lot of conflict, international conflict, and I have a 19-year-old son. There are 19-year-old sons being sent to parts of the world in the cause of independence, right or wrong, not important right now, in the cause of independence that will pay the ultimate sacrifice. Those sons will, and those families will lose somebody, and that's the ultimate sacrifice in the cause of freedom or the cause of independence. And so, if that is my comparison, leaving $50,000 on the table is pocket change. And I am very, very happy and joyful to say that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make that is so insignificant to the sacrifice other people's have made, historically speaking. And it's actually with like joy and then this common community and this pursuit of protecting an independent space that I'm happy to participate in. And it doesn't feel like the burden it does when you think about the sacrifice of homeschooling independently or any form of independent education. And so I think really it's about how we approach it. If we reshape it in that way, it's not a strain, it's a blessing.
I love that. No, you're absolutely right because a lot of times when you think of it from the perspective of missing out, like look what I'm leaving on the table. You
Mhm.
actually have to flip it and say, what am I giving up? As a
Mm.
result of me accepting this, what are the strings that are attached? Because it always starts off like the honeymoon, right? So it's like, here it is, just go ahead and do this. But there are things that come up after. And maybe honeymoon is a bad idea because that puts a bad light on marriage. But anyways, the point is it starts off with like, here, just take this. And then as you're into it, sometimes knee deep, it's like, oh, by the way, you also need to do this. And oh, by the way, to maintain that 50K, here's some other restrictions.
Well, the issue with that too is the people that are trying to hand us money right now are genuinely kind, mostly probably very similar worldviews. Like, this is how I'm going to help you. And and I actually think probably if they never left their office, in some states, if you could guarantee that you will stay there for forever, maybe we could just hand out money without oversight and regulation and accountability, which again, I don't even think is a good thing. However, The political process being what it is, we understand that things can change very quickly. And so I feel like it's slightly arrogant for those who make laws to, make promises that they won't be around to keep. And they put families in very vulnerable positions that you will be used as political pawns going forward because you are now enrolled in a government program. And so, consequently, the next person that oversees the government program can do whatever they want with that thing. There are no guarantees. Lots of states have changed regimes, if you will. Um, our country has gone through many changes where education has been in the crosshairs. Harvard, you can say this. Harvard, you can say this. And all of this is attached to whether or not you are taking government money. And so you get to say and do what you want to do as an independent entity. But once you are receiving public funds, the public has an obligation and a right to how those dollars are spent. And so the best way to not be caught in the middle is to not be on a program to begin with.
That's right. And I'm glad that you brought that up because this is a gubernatorial election year for New Jersey. So people get out and vote. Your civic
Yeah.
engagement goes beyond the 4 years of voting for president. Politics is local. You need to know who you're putting into office. As you think of this conversation, think about whose values align with what we're saying or with your values, and just make sure that you vote that person in. Do not sit on the sidelines on November 4th. Please go out and vote. Final thoughts, Lauren.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. I think most state constitutions say something to the degree of all power is vested within the people. And I think we get that thing turned around so many times, we don't realize that not only do we have the privilege to vote, we have the responsibility to vote and participate because the people hold the power. There is no plan B. And so, in your absence and in your apathy, somebody else will make decisions on your behalf. And because we have been given the right to steward this liberty, there are no excuses when we don't. It is literally both, again, our blessing and our obligation to steward the freedom that we've been given well.
Mic drop. Thank you, Lauren. Always a pleasure being with you. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Anyways, it's good to see you again.